succeeded after 5 years in this of getting an introduction which actually neglects the 12 years of my investment banking experience. And I thank you for that. I didn't imagine it would first happen in the Chamber of Commerce, but there you go. And I'd really like to thank Jack and the Chamber. It's always great to be with you and to have the opportunity for some dialogue. Can everybody hear me? I know we're operating without a mic, so I just want to make sure. And thank you to Malkin for sponsoring. You guys are a really key part of this community and do some wonderful things. The Metro Green Project is really something to be proud of nationally. We're all following you in the news these days. A lot of excitement at the company. What I thought I might do is maybe just take 12-15 minutes or so to touch on a couple of topics in order, I think, of relevance to your operations and businesses. And I'm happy to we'll leave some time so we can talk about, we were talking about Syria over here. In virtue of my new appointment to the Intelligence Committee, I'm seeing a lot that I didn't used to see on issues like North Korea and Syria and Iran, and I'm happy to talk about those if people are interested. But let me start by saying that, after a reasonably constructive start to the 113th Congress, we're a bit in the doldrums right now. And the reason I say reasonably constructive start was because January, after a 2-year Congress that was still sort of polarized to a point of dysfunction, January was actually a pretty good month. We got the Sandy relief bill passed. That's important to everybody in this room. $60 billion. That was not an easy lift in this environment. We got that passed, strong bipartisan support. We got the Violence Against Women Act passed, strong bipartisan support. And of course, this will be controversial and people will have different views on this, but on January 1st we passed a bill which, by raising the top marginal rates on households earning more than $450,000, will over 10 years produce $700 billion in revenue. Now, people hate taxes, I get that, but the reason I highlight that is because it had been 20 years since any Republican in Congress had voted for additional revenue. And I'm not fearing that. I'm just observing that that is actually, considering how polarized the previous Congress had been, that was an indication that even as polarized as it remains, there is the possibility of getting things done. Now, so what things do I think can get done? Two that I think will have significant impact on our communities, your businesses, your operations. I want to touch on briefly the fiscal situation, sequester, debt ceiling, all that good stuff. And then I want to talk a little bit about immigration. I can predict the latter better than I can predict the former. We're all going through the both real and political difficulties of the sequestration. You all know what the sequestration was. It was never designed to go into place. In fact, it was designed to be so bad that the super committee, it seems like ancient history now, but the super committee would come together, the Democrats and the Republicans, to do the grand bargain, the big deal that finds you $4 trillion in savings over 10 years that puts the country's debt on a sustainable path. That did not happen. So now we're living with this with the sequester. Again, nobody supports it. Our bluff was called. Turns out that it is less unacceptable to members of Congress than we thought it would be, and it also turns out that we're craven enough that when it feels unacceptable, we'll pass legislation to change what feels unacceptable. And people are right to say, oh, that's great. You guys are perfectly willing to stand up for the FAA and business travelers and whatnot, but what about Head Start? What about 70,000 kids who aren't going to get to join a Head Start program? Very pointed and legitimate criticism. I wish I could tell you that there's any probability that the pain will build to a point where the sequester alone will force a deal. I can't tell you that. I don't believe that. By the way, there will be more pain. This room is not heavy with defense contractors, but other rooms are, and I'll tell you, they are having a really rough time. There's really no corner of the federal government that is not somewhat touched by these cuts. And most agencies will also tell you, as they tell me, that it's not necessarily the magnitude of the cuts, it's the fact that they're across the board and there's no flexibility to manage, which is a real problem. What does, and here's the, I guess, somewhat optimistic perspective, what does force a rethink, and what does force a replacement of the sequester with something smarter, and what does force the next conversation around our fiscal future, which means cuts and taxes, and anything we can do to help generate growth along the way, is the impending debt ceiling, which we technically hit in late May. The Treasury can do their thing and manage cash flow and do whatever it is they do, such that there's no risk of default until towards the end of July. But that is the catalyst for a discussion between the Congress and the President and the parties within the Congress to hopefully, and here's where I start getting a little aspirational, to hopefully do what I think we should do, which is to finish the job of getting our budget in order. And I do say finish. I talked about a $4 trillion number. This is what the economists told us 3 years ago we needed to hit. Find $4 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. A variety of measures, including the Budget Control Act, the January deal that I told you about, has gotten us a little over halfway there, $2.7 trillion. Now the number's gotten a little bit bigger in the interim. So we're about halfway there. And we need to find the other roughly $2 trillion in savings over 10 years. And importantly, and you're hearing this from a Democrat, importantly, we need to do the hard work and take the tough decisions to put our Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid programs on a sustainable path. Now we're going to do that, if I have anything to say about it, and I do, not a lot, but something, we're going to do that in a fair and equitable way. We're not going to ask poor elderly people to make up for the sins of the past, and there are so many other alternatives. But we need to do that. Sometimes on the left wing of my party, people don't want to accept that, but there is a powerful progressive case to be made for entitlement reform, which is that if we don't do this, it's simple math. 20, 25 years from now, if we don't reform the Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security programs, they will consume the vast bulk of the federal budget. That means libraries, FAA, defense, everything else that we rely on the government to do is now slowly being taken off the table. So what happens? The possibility, of course, is that in July we can renegotiate the sequester, come up with some fair and equitable reforms for Medicare and Social Security. The President has put something on the table that some of you will be expert on called the chain CPI. Controversial, of course. Other ideas around Social Security, they're on the table. In exchange for those Medicare, this is just the politics of it, in exchange for those entitlement reforms, the Republicans presumably come to the table with some additional revenue. They agreed to roughly $700 billion in January. Speaker Boehner's best offer to the President in the many negotiations they've had, the best offer was about another $300 to $400 billion over 10 years in revenue. So let's just imagine, I don't know if it is, but let's imagine that's on the table. You start to see the outlines of a deal. And that would be a good thing. I mean, to restructure the sequester, to finally be able to look at ourselves and say, hey, you know, maybe we don't like 70% debt to GDP, but at least it's moving in the right direction in the next 10 to 15 years. Then we would move on to talking about energy and education. I'm not saying we'd get stuff done, but we would move on to talking about the forward-looking investments and ideas that answer the question, what is it you are cutting towards? What is the point of fixing our fiscal mess? What do you want to achieve as a country in the coming decades, which presumably has a lot to do with infrastructure and energy and education and these things that we can start to see are important to our futures and our kids' futures. Now, could that go wrong? It could go wrong. These discussions are the most polarizing discussions that we have in the Congress, but at least you see a lot of pressure forcing those discussions, and you see the outlines of a deal. A deal that makes nobody particularly happy. The left wing of the Democratic Party is going to go absolutely bananas regardless of what you propose on entitlement reform, and there are some very hard cases on the Republican side who will not tolerate the prospect of one more dime in revenue. Now, by the way, let me spend a moment on, because this is relevant to you, on what another dime in revenue looks like. The Congress is done on rates. So if you are going to generate new revenue without touching rates, you do it by looking at the spending that we do in the tax code through the credits and the deductions and other benefits. And there's two approaches to that. There's one approach which, from a pure public policy standpoint, makes a lot of sense, which is we give everybody money through the tax code. We give farmers money, we give solar power companies, we give heavy PP&E companies money, we give real estate partnerships money, we give everybody money through the tax code. So what if we had a conversation about where do we really want to be giving people money through the tax code? And we'd have some conversations about the deductibility of a second home on your tax return. We'd have some conversations about other things that are very hard. You know, politicians love to talk about the tax benefits that go to the oil companies and the tax benefit. The president loves the tax benefits that he loves to talk about, the tax benefits that apparently go to people who fly private jets. Because those are the easy ones, right? But remember, we're talking about the mortgage interest tax deduction, we're talking about the deductibility of philanthropic contributions, we're talking about the fact that we don't tax health plans, stuff that really hits us at home as an American middle class, or frankly as any American. So anyway, that's one approach. the other approach is just, we can't do that because every single one of those tax benefits, no matter how small or how targeted or apparently silly to somebody's eyes, is somebody's lunch. And that somebody whose lunch is being threatened has a lobbyist in D.C. who's being paid a lot of money to point out the terrific societal benefits that come from XYZ tax credit. So that becomes a little bit of a political mess, and it leads you to route number 2, which is less satisfying from a public policy standpoint, but a lot easier to do, which is just we're going to cap deductions at 28%. And that, of course, is something the president has proposed. I'd be sad to see it go that way because it means that we give up that conversation about our societal priorities, but it may be where we end up. And so those of you who, to whom interest treatment on municipal bonds is important, health insurance treatment, this is something to keep a close eye on in the coming months. Second topic I wanted to touch on is something that it's hard to be positive and optimistic about all those things you need to do to get your budget and your debt and your deficit in order, because none of them are particularly fun to talk about. This topic, though, I actually am increasingly really excited about, which is, I think for the first time in a couple of decades, we are very close to the possibility of comprehensive immigration reform. And the more I get into it, the more you get into it, you're going to come to realize, like I do, that this isn't just about 11 million undocumented people in our country. It's not just about the border. If we do this right, this is going to be about Social Security. It's going to be about fiscal responsibility because we're going to have millions of new taxpayers paying income tax. It'll be about innovation and overhaul of H-1B visa programs so that we don't run out of H-1B visas on day 3 in which they're available. And it'll be about family reunification so that we put an emphasis on creating nuclear families as a support structure for new immigrants. I'll tell you flat out, while not perfect, and I suppose if I were king and could tinker with it, there would be some things I would change, but this is a good deal. Chuck Schumer told me last week that he thinks that he can get 70 votes in the United States Senate for this thing. And I like what I see. Very briefly, it has money for further border protection, which is good. Our borders need to be secure. I tend to say that more with a national security hat on than with an immigration hat on, because remember, half the people who come to this country or half the people who are undocumented overstay visas. So don't ever let anybody tell you that if we just had high enough walls on the border, we'd solve the problem. But it does have border money. It has targets and goals that we must hit in interdicting people who are trying to cross the border, which is, again, is fine. Secondly, and importantly, and this is, to my way of thinking anyway, even more important than the border, and it's going to make some people uncomfortable, there will be a mechanism. It may be e-verify, it may be some sort of form of identification card that is going to finally and definitively let employers know if prospective employees are entitled to work here. And with that will come a regime that says to those who are willing to break the law to get an unfair advantage on people who abide by the law, there's going to be very stiff penalties. Now you get, of course, at the reason that people overstay visas across the border, and if we can do that, we really will have achieved something. With respect, and third, and importantly, and this is controversial in some circles, but there would be an earned path to citizenship for the 11 million people who are here illegally now, some of whom are here in Stamford. And it is controversial, but I think it's terribly important. Look, here's the way it's structured, and it'll change over time, but so long as you arrived in this country before December of 2011, when this law goes into effect, you will be able to go to a federal office and register. And provided that you have not been convicted of a felony or of 3 misdemeanors, you will be issued a document which allows you to work legally in this country. It will not permit you to get any federal benefits. No Social Security disability, no Pell Grants, no federal benefits, but you will be normalized and allowed to work. This is important for people in this room for reasons I don't need to elaborate on. We will remove that uncertainty and change the lives of these people who, I don't need to tell you, live in the shadows, who in many instances are abused by their employers, who are afraid to go to a hospital when they're injured. And the idea is, or the proposal is, that after 10 years, quite a lengthy period of time, and that 10-year number is driven by how long it's going to take to clear the applications that are currently in, people who have applied for green cards legally, after 10 years, they would, provided they have paid taxes, provided they have stayed out of trouble with the law, stayed employed, and I guess there's an English language requirement in there. I think it's shown some proficiency in English. They will then, after 10 years, be issued a green card with the prospect of, again, an additional 3 years after that, a total of 13 years, being able to apply for citizenship. That will be amply debated in the Congress. There are people who call that amnesty and who are not comfortable with it. It's not amnesty. These are not middle class, much less wealthy people, and the law would call for the payment of a $2,000 fine to acknowledge that a law was broken, and admitting wrongdoing, in other words, owning up to committing a crime. And then all of that path is, as I said, available to those people. So I'm excited personally about this because it's hard to imagine a system that works less well than the one we have. We're spending an immense amount of money to forcibly deport people from the country, more money than we've ever spent as a country. In addition to just being a huge drain on our treasury, if you've ever heard these stories, they're pretty tragic. Families are being broken up and armed men are pounding into basements. That's not a long-term viable way to run an immigration policy. And done right, I think we have the opportunity to sort of do away with all that's bad about our current immigration system and replace it with something that I think is both morally and economically very good for the country. Last note, this is, I think, of particular interest to us in Connecticut. I get asked frequently about the status of gun safety legislation in the Congress. And it's not a terribly good story. There will be different opinions in this room. I personally am a supporter of Second Amendment rights. I actually I don't own a gun, but I enjoy shooting them. But I am adamant that we can do a much better job creating a regulatory structure around this very dangerous technology that could dramatically reduce the violence that we, of course, all felt so personally on December 14th. As you saw, 2 weeks ago in the Senate, every proposal federally for gun safety legislation went down because the Senate is what it is. It went, the Manchin-Toomey deal, which is universal background checks, went down, a majority of senators having voted for it, and as the President said, 90% of Americans supporting the idea of universal background checks. I don't often take, I was telling Chet this, I don't often take what happens on Capitol Hill personally, but I did take that vote personally. Not by the way because of Newtown, that obviously is something that we all continue to struggle with, but because my day is filled with good arguments. How much to tax, how little to tax, abortion, you name it. I mean, these are legitimate discussions. And frankly, in gun control, we should argue about what an assault rifle is and whether you should be allowed to have it. We should argue about the number of bullets in a magazine. Those are all fair arguments, but there is no argument against checking out anybody who wants to buy a gun regardless of where they buy it. The way the world is right now, you can be an Al-Qaeda sleeper cell and go to a gun show in Virginia and buy 10 handguns. And that's just, or a violent felon. That's just my way of thinking. There is no good argument for why that should be true. So, what happens? Remember, here's the optimistic note. Remember that after President Reagan was shot, I guess it was 82 or so, it was a good 6 or 7 years before the assault weapon ban was implemented in the U.S. Congress. It had made it to the floor a number of times and had failed. And it's not just me, it's not just Chris Murphy and Elizabeth Esty who are a little closer to this than I am. I'll tell you, Chris had a conversation with a couple of families from Newtown shortly after the Senate vote failed, and I think he told me it was one of the tougher conversations he was going to have. And this family said, we never imagined that this was going to be a 3-month or a 6-month solution. This is about changing attitudes, about changing emotions, about overcoming emotions. So this is a project of years, and that's where I think. I'm long-run optimistic about our ability to preserve our Second Amendment rights, but to have changes that will keep all of us